Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar to discuss immigration and global mobility issues in times of COVID. My name is Annie, and I will be facilitating this session for you today. So today's presentation will be given by a set of panelists from the Americas, who are all lawyers in different US Laboris firms. We have lawyers from the US, Canada, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico joining us today. Okay, that's it from me. I will now hand over to our moderator, Geetha Adinata from the USA. Go ahead, Geetha, you're welcome to start.
Annie, could you please put up the presentation?
Yes, sure.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon or good morning to everyone attending today. We're very, very pleased to be able to present to you this webinar. My name is Geetha Adinata, and I'm the lead I lead the U.S. immigration practice at FordHarrison, and I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm also joined by my colleague Lauren Locke, who is based in our Atlanta office. I'm also joined, I'm very honored to be joined by 7 of my US and international colleagues from the Youth Laboris Alliance, representing the Americas. And we hope that we can bring you some more Americas-based programming in the future. You may be attending today because you have operations in the Americas and you need to mobilize your talent. Today, we'll be talking about the state of global mobility to the Americas, just 7 or 8 months after COVID started ravaging the world. Specifically, we will be discussing 3 topics that we hope will give you a better understanding of COVID-related travel restrictions and requirements to the Americas. These include requirements and restrictions related to, first, entry to a specific country in the Americas. Number 2, post-arrival requirements to travel within a country. And then finally, we want to give you just a brief glimpse of what we believe is on the horizon for immigration and global mobility to each of our jurisdictions. Keep in mind, there are 7 countries represented here, so we will not have the opportunity to get very technical or in-depth on the elements that we're explaining now, but we welcome you to reach out to us to ask any questions via the chat feature or after our presentation. With that, I'd like to have each of my colleagues introduce themselves briefly, and then we can launch into the presentation. First, can we have German? Could you introduce yourself?
German, I think you are on mute.
Hello, my name is German Capulet. I'm a partner at Funes de Rioja, the Argentinian Youth Laboris law firm. I'm specialized in employment law and immigration law. Thank you.
Great. Marcela, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, of course, Kirita. Thank you. This is Marcela Salazar, partner at Munita and Olavarría, a law firm from Chile. I'm also specialized in immigration and employment law.
Thank you. Katie Van Nostrand.
Thank you, Geetha. I'm Katie Van Ostrand. I run the Global Immigration Group at Mathews, Dinsdale, and Clark out of our Vancouver, BC office. It's actually not raining today.
Maria Luisa.
Hi, I'm Maria Luisa Soter. I'm a partner at Veirano Advogados in Brazil. I had the immigration practice, and I also specialize in labor and employment matters. I'm a retired labor judge.
Thank you. Lauren Locke.
Hi, I'm Lauren Locke. I work with Geetha, except in a different office. I'm based in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States, focusing exclusively on immigration.
Thank you. Diana.
Hi, my name is Diana. I am an associate and leader of the immigration practice of Brigard Urrutia, the US Laboris law firm in Colombia.
Thank you. Margarita.
Hi, thank you, Geetha. I'm Margarita Ortiz from Basham, Ringe, Correa in Mexico. I'm a senior associate, and I specialize in immigration also. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Annie, can we go to the first slide, please? Wonderful. I wanted to take this time to tell you a little bit about the entry requirements and restrictions to the United States right now. There are two major things that are at interplay when you're considering whether to send one of your employees to the U.S. There are two major considerations that have to both be considered. Number one, President Trump back in June issued a visa ban where he banned visas in certain categories, such as H-1B, L-1s, H-2B, and J-1 visas. Now, a federal court in the United States has enjoined that proclamation the president released, trying to ban the issuance of these particular visas, which are heavily used by businesses. So at this time, it is not being enforced, but it is something that we are watching to see how the court proceedings play out and whether this, the injunction will last. So that's on one hand, you have a sort of potential for a visa ban. The next thing is that since COVID hit, the U.S. government has restricted travel to the United States from certain countries, specifically anybody who has been within one of the following countries may not come to, who has been within one of these countries within 14 days of their U.S. entry will not be allowed to come to the U.S. That includes the Brazil, China, all 26 countries of the Schengen area, Iran, Ireland, the United Kingdom. So if anybody has been within those countries within 14 days, they will not be allowed to come to the U.S. until they have established a 14-day quarantine in a non-banned country. So what I can tell you about this particular restriction is that it is not only applicable to citizens of those countries, it is anybody of any nationality who has physically been present in those countries. The main benefit that has come out of the last few months from the government is that they have acknowledged that they are issuing national interest exceptions to waive some of these restrictions, travel restrictions, and allowing a foreign national to enter the U.S. More quickly. So you can request a national interest exception to waive that 14-day quarantine requirement so that you can come to the U.S. more quickly or immediately. And you can request that national interest exception in a few different ways. You can apply for it immediately at the time that you're applying for a U.S. visa at a U.S. consulate in the foreign jurisdiction. Essentially, what we recommend is that your employer present to you or give you a letter that explains what the national interest is for your position and for your entry to the U.S. You can also make the national interest exception request directly at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. When you arrive in the U.S. airport, or if you're coming in by the land at the borders, you can make it immediately at the point of arrival. Now, the port-specific instructions there's a variety of them. They're all over the board. So it's very, very important that you understand any specific procedures so they can make the request for the national interest exception in the way that it's required in that jurisdiction. Typically, that exception is approved for a single entry, and you must enter within 30 days of it being issued. In addition, that national interest exception is granted with no consideration of the traveler's COVID-19 status, so they don't require any kind of testing or proving that you have been tested recently. And finally, the bases for the request of a national interest exception must be either humanitarian, public health, national security, or economic recovery. And those things can be interpreted, the economic recovery item can be interpreted very broadly. So it's something that we have seen work successfully, allowing companies to be able to transfer their workers very quickly. With that, I'll turn it over to Katie to talk to us about Canada.
Thank you, Gita. There are a number of misconceptions flying around, and I'm sure my other colleagues in other countries have found these as well. One of the biggest questions I get is, well, we're not allowed to actually travel to Canada right now, are we? And you can in many cases, but Canada is very, very particular about who they let in, and how quickly that person can actually join the rest of society once they are let into Canada. So Canadian borders do remain closed for optional and discretionary travel. You do need to have an essential reason for travel to Canada at this time. However, once a person has been approved for a work permit from outside of Canada, or in some cases at the border, they are then deemed essential. So in some cases, there are allowances for for students coming into Canada, although most of the schools have completed online only studies at this point. But any workers or business visitors, it is possible to enter Canada for a particular working reason, as long as you can prove that your job still is in place in Canada. It hasn't been shut down because of the pandemic, and that you do have an essential reason for coming. So you do have that actual job offer and pre-approval. For people coming from countries other than the USA, for the most part, they are required to apply for their work permits in advance of entering Canada. This is done online through Immigration Canada's online work permit application system. Unfortunately, processing times are extremely long at the moment. There are, as Gita mentioned, for the US, in Canada, we also have some national interest exceptions, which can make processing quite a bit faster. We also have some allowances for reuniting family members with persons who are working in Canada currently, or have Canadian immediate family members. But again, those processing times, and although it is possible, it is taking quite a number of weeks and sometimes months to allow the exception for the person to enter Canada. If someone is coming in from the USA, no matter their nationality, as long as they're visa exempt, they are actually allowed to fly directly or drive directly into Canada and make their application for a work permit or business visitor entry at the port of entry. So that would be the land border crossing or the airport. They would have to show again that they have an actual job offer that remains open in Canada, and would have to have any other pre-approval documentation with them. The offer of employment to a foreign national exempt from an LMIA, that confirmation A number, or a labor market impact assessment, or some form of confirmation that they would be providing specialized technical services, which may be exempt from the requirement to hold a work permit, after sales services, for example. There's definitely a benefit to being in the USA at this point to enter Canada, because there's no waiting for a work permit to be approved, and there's no, the other thing I should mention as well is that there's no actual requirement to prove that your work in Canada is essential. You don't have to prove that you're going to be a teacher or a doctor or working on an essential infrastructure project. The fact that you have been pre-approved for your work permit deems you essential, and at that point you're then allowed to enter Canada. I think that should be all. I'll move over to Chile now.
Thank you, Katie. I have been asked the same question, how to enter Chile. And similar to most Latin American countries, on March 18th, Chile closed its borders in response to the outbreak of coronavirus. In general, only Chilean citizens and residents of Chile are allowed to enter into the country. In addition, those foreigners who are whose applications are being processed by the Department of Foreign Affairs are also allowed to enter into the country. On the other hand, those who have stamped their visas in their passport through the Chilean consulars abroad, they're not allowed to enter the country if they have not made an effective entry before the pandemic. So they will have to last in their main countries until the authorities put out place all these restrictions. However, on October 10th, the new reports of cases of coronavirus have decreased, so the government has eased some of the restrictions to enter into Chile. As a result of this, foreign nationals may now be allowed to enter if they are coming for urgent business purposes, which are convenient and useful for Chile. In addition, they will also be allowed to enter if they have to do urgent and essential professional work, or if they have professional reasons which cannot be postponed. Moreover, the government has also recognized that these travel restrictions, very strict restrictions that they have imposed, have had an impact in those who have families living in Chile. And therefore, it now allows extended family members from Chilean citizens and residents of Chile to come into Chile, such as, for example, spouses, parents, partners, to enter into Chile. But all these exceptions, all these exceptional cases will be required at the airport of a consular self-passage. Otherwise, they will not be allowed to enter into the country. Transit passengers are accepted at the airport in connection with other countries without passing through immigration control in Chile. However, tourists are not allowed to enter yet into the country. Moreover, if you're entering Chile, you will face health screening controls at the airport. So be prepared for that. Now, Isa, if you want to share us your comments for Brazil. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Marcela. Well, Brazil, differently from most of the countries, now does have some more flexibility. So we do have restrictions which are published monthly. So we have a general restriction for entrance by roads, transportation, or other means of land transportation, and also by sea. But those restrictions do not apply to Brazilian citizens, those who have residency in Brazil, those who are accredited before the Brazilian government or work for international organizations, humanitarian reasons, cargo transportation, and relatives, parents, children, spouses, partners of Brazilian citizens. So we do have lots of exceptions, generally speaking. And with respect to air travel, everyone is allowed. It doesn't matter the purpose of the trip, even if it's for tourism purposes. There are no restrictions whatsoever. Again, as I said, these restrictions are published monthly. So every month we have something new coming in. So the last norm was published on October 14. And now it has opened up to Paraguayan citizens to enter Brazil by road. So this norm now is in effect until November 13. The other thing is the work authorizations, like prior residence applications for work visas and consular visa applications, irrespective of the reason of the trip, they are being processed regularly. So that should not be an issue for anyone coming to Brazil. So actually, we think that, sometimes I think they're opening too much. Like 2 months ago, the norm 2 months ago provided that foreigners coming to Brazil for tourism purposes needed to have health insurance. And in the last one, they took that out. So sometimes, it seems that they do want people to come as tourists to increase the economy. So Diana, what about Colombia?
Thank you, Isa. At the beginning of the pandemic, Colombia had a situation similar to what happened in Chile. As a measure to control the spread of COVID-19, the government of Colombia prohibited the disembarkation of international travelers as of March 23rd, except in the case of humanitarian flights. Taking into account that several Colombian residents were unable to return to the country before the border closure, immigration authorities adopted the protocol for the return of Colombian citizens and foreign residents who were in vulnerable conditions. These individuals were able to return to Colombia in humanitarian flights, and this protocol came into effect on April 10th. It is important to note that during this period, the immigration authorities suspended some of the terms and procedures for the procurement of immigration documents, such as consular visas and foreigners' ID cards. However, on September 1st, the mandatory preventive isolation measures ended and the selective isolation began as a new stage of Colombia to control and manage the pandemic. In this context, as of September 16th, the Colombian Aeronautic ordered to lift the suspension of disembarkation for the purpose of entering or connecting Colombian territory. The reactivation of international transportation will be carried out gradually and progressively and in compliance with biosafety protocols. The Ministry of Transportation has stated that in several press conferences that this first reactivation process will be from routes coming from the United States, Ecuador, Mexico, Bolivia, Brazil, Dominican Republic, and Guatemala. So with this in mind, it is possible to conclude that at this stage, foreigners can enter the country either with an entry stamp or a visa when appropriate, as long as they do so through the permitted routes and with airlines with which Colombia has issued the corresponding authorizations. So this is the situation upon entering Colombia. I will pass it over to my colleague, Germán from Argentina.
Thank you, Diana. In Argentina, the national government implemented several measures to try to avoid the spread of the COVID-19. The first one was the implementation of suspension of international flights coming from China, South Korea, Iran, Japan, USA, UK, European Union States. 4 days later, international flights from Chile and Brazil were suspended as well. Regarding internal flights in Argentina, from the 20th of March until last week were suspended. The Ministry of Transport authorized internal flights, but limited to essential workers and people who need to travel for medical reasons only. Today, international flights are still suspended, and only repatriation flights and flights with a special authorization from the National Civil Aviation Administration are allowed. We have some frequencies to Europe, USA, and Latin American countries, but these are services that continue to be specials. Another measure implemented at the beginning of the pandemic is the closure of our borders from the 16th of March until October 25th. Only Argentinians and foreign nationals with temporary or permanent residence in our country are entitled to return. Regarding consular visa, it has been suspended since the beginning of the pandemic in March and still remains suspended until further notice, but there is a special authorization process that has been implemented for essential workers. So technicians and some professionals have been entitled to travel to Argentina with a previous authorization by Immigration Office and the Argentine Foreign Office Affair. And finally, the new requirement established in September was an electronic affidavit that has been implemented recently. Anyone traveling to Argentina must complete this online application form 48 hours before boarding. This is the situation in Argentina. I will pass now to Margarita from Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now in Mexico, due to the health crisis derived from COVID-19 and as a result of its spread in Mexico, the General Health Council issued a declaration of health emergency on March 30. Regardless of the declaration of health emergency, the Mexican government decreed that borders would not be subject to closures and no travel restrictions by land, air, or sea should be implemented, except for non-essential travel carried through the land border between Mexico and the US. On March 21, the US and Mexican governments released a joint statement by which travel restrictions were established. As part of the joint initiative, some of the recognized essential activities and services are, but not limited to, trade, health and emergency services, work trips, temporary and permanent residence, visits of diplomatic or official nature. In view of this, trips of a non-essential nature are suspended. The joint initiative has been subject to extensions and remains in effect to this date. Regarding the South land border, no official additional restrictions were imposed due to COVID-19. Also, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs decreed in March the suspension of all activities and services provided by Mexican embassies and consulates abroad, except for those derived from emergency situations and services to Mexican nationals. Consequently, issuance of visas was suspended. In recent months, however, Mexican consulates have gradually resumed the visa services. Nevertheless, some delays can still be expected. Now I'll turn it over to Gita again. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Now we're going to talk about post-arrival requirements for each jurisdiction. I'm going to let Lauren Locke, my colleague in Atlanta, talk about the United States.
Hi, everyone. While it's tricky to get into the United States in the first place for a lot of people coming from a lot of other locations outside the United States, once you're in, it is not that complicated. Most states have no travel restrictions at all. Those who do, a lot of them are voluntary, or even if they're not voluntary, there is no penalty. There's no actual interception of interstate travelers, either driving or on train or flying. There is not a robust system of contact tracing going on for the pandemic. There is no national oversight of where people are going within the United States. So once you're here, there is very little difficulty traveling, and with that increased risk that no one else is looking out for your protection from COVID other than yourself.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lauren. And we'll turn it over to Katie to talk about Canada.
Thank you, Lauren and Gita. We are very different from the US here in Canada, I guess, on this point. Canada has a very, very robust contact tracing and quarantine system in place for any traveler, including Canadians and permanent residents who enter the country. There's a requirement for anyone entering the country, again, no matter if you're a citizen or a permanent resident or a foreign national, there is a requirement to quarantine for 14 days on entry to Canada. Canada is so specific about this that they actually have invented an app that people can download on their phones before even entering Canada to prepare and pre-submit their quarantine plan. Quarantine plan is required. The CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agents, will review your quarantine plan. And if they don't believe that it's reasonable, you will be sent directly to government-assisted quarantine. There are a number of hotels around the country who have opted into this service, and you're basically put in a hotel for the entire 14 days, and then assisted into hospitals and medical care if you do develop symptoms and get sick. There's a check-in system for anyone who is quarantining in their own home or in an Airbnb, for example, if they're a traveler. Or their new apartment in Canada. Our federal police service, the RCMP, will phone you. They will come to your house. They'll check to make sure that you're actually at home quarantining. And there are fines of up to $750,000 Canadian for anyone who is found to be going against the quarantine requirements. There are some very, very minor or very, very, very narrow, I should say, exceptions to the quarantine exemption for persons who are coming into Canada. For example, specialized technicians who have to repair machinery or install machinery that is required for essential infrastructure, some medical professionals, people who regularly cross the border for work, truck drivers, for example, who are delivering food services. But for the most part, everyone who comes into Canada is required to quarantine. There are also some additional quarantine measures in place between provinces in Canada. The Eastern Atlantic provinces are probably one of the best known requirement here. We're calling it the Atlantic bubble. And if you go into any of the Atlantic provinces, you're required to quarantine for 14 days before you go out and go to work or visit family, etc. In any of those Atlantic and Canadian provinces. Another important point for Canadian employers, if they are bringing foreign workers into Canada during the 14-day quarantine period, they are required to pay their foreign workers in Canada their full-time wage, full salary while they're quarantining. Those employees are able to work remotely from their location of quarantine as long as they can do so safely without breaking quarantine. And if you have an engineer, for example, who would have to be at the job site and they're not able to work while they're in quarantine, they still must be paid in full during that quarantine period. And that requirement is also in place if you have an employee who is coming into Canada and they arrive before their actual work starts, before their start date in Canada, they would still need to be paid those 14 days. And with that, I believe we'll throw it over to Marcela.
Thank you, Katie. Our restrictions are very similar as Canada, not that as the US ones. All Chilean citizens, residents of Chile, and those foreigners are allowed to enter into the country are required to do a mandatory 14-day quarantine period upon their arrival to Chile. However, this requirement has recently removed by the authorities only if they are provided with a negative coronavirus test exam. This exam must have been performed up to 72 hours before entry to Chile and must have been carried out by a recognized health authority laboratory in the place or in the country where it was taken. However, those who do not comply with this negative test exam, they must comply with the quarantine in the city where they have arrived to before continuing to move to other places in Chile. So if you arrive to Santiago, for example, which is normally the place where you arrive at the airport to, you will have to stay to do your quarantine here in Santiago unless you have this negative coronavirus test exam. There are also some other restrictions on intercity travels where sanitary cordons are in place now. In this case, all travelers may be subject to temperature screening. They should carry a sanitary passport and sworn statement. Moreover, if they're moving or they're going to districts under isolation, they will also be required of a temporary permission obtained from the Chilean police. There are some mandatory sanitary measures that are currently in place in the national territory, which I think it should be considered before coming to Chile. And for example, curfew is in all of Chile is still in place every day from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. And in the region of Magallanes, the southern part of Chile, it starts at 8 p.m. and ends at 5 a.m. In addition, the use of masks in all the Chilean territory is mandatory if you are in an urban area of the country. So, Maria Luisa, is there anything you can say up to the arrival in Brazil?
Well, differently from the rest of the world, no official guidelines to be followed, no airport protocols, no quarantine measures except for ships and platforms. And like I said, norms change every month. Like a few months ago, there was a norm to the effect that people should present medical certificates before boarding. Now there's nothing of that. Some airports do have some kind of control, mainly for internal travel, but nobody's asking anything when the people arrive in Brazil, where they're going to be staying or checking temperatures or nothing of the sort most of the time, which is kind of worrisome. And with that, I'll pass it on to Diana.
Thank you, Isa. In Colombia, with the opening of Colombian international air borders, the immigration authorities adopted the biosafety protocol for international travelers enforceable as of September 17th. Among the obligations that travelers must observe, it is important to highlight the following. Travelers must fill out the electronic check-me format before entering or leaving Colombian territory. This process can be done from 24 hours to 1 hour before the trip. The check-me is an application designed by the immigration authorities to monitor the inflow of foreigners. Second place, travelers should show proof of a PCR test with a negative result for COVID with no more than 96 hours before the flight. So this is very important. And by showing this document, while it is mandatory, they're not required to do a 14-day quarantine, which I've seen it is like a mandatory requirement for many of the countries we have seen today. It is not necessary here in Colombia at this point. Travelers should maintain the biosafety measures of distancing and disinfection of hands according to the airport signs. And the automatic migration and biometric services will be enabled for the use of previously registered travelers. On the other hand, immigration authorities must comply with the following measures. Among others, they should verify travel documents. But at this stage, there are no entry restrictions based on nationality beyond visas when applicable. In the event that a possible case of COVID-19 is detected, the authorities must activate a protocol of public health event of international importance. And they should also apply biosafety protocols. In turn, airport operators should provide information about the protocols of distancing and health prevention. They must implement and monitor thermal cameras to determine the temperature of multiple passengers with real time and quickly. And they should also guarantee presence of health professionals in all terminals of the airport. It should be noted that at this time, most of the immigration processes are enabled with the exception of visa stamping and switching visa types within Colombian territory. So at this time, foreigner can request an electronic visa either through a consulate abroad or through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs if they are in Colombia. Nevertheless, immigration offices are operating only with 30% of their normal activity. So it is natural to find substantial delays in securing an appointment to do any of the processes that are enabled at this point. While in Colombia, nationals and foreigners, everybody should wear a face mask. But as said before, there's no curfew and there's no quarantine at this point, just self-isolation and like responsible isolation at this stage. I will pass it over to my colleague, German from Argentina.
Thank you, Diana. In Argentina, from September 15th, all airlines flying to our country must comply with the new protocols. Before boarding, the airline must check the temperature of every person, crew, and passengers. And those who have a temperature higher than 37.5 degrees Celsius will have to postpone their trip unless they have a medical certificate justifying that the high temperature could be associated to a different disease. Anyone who registered in the last 14 days 2 or more COVID-19 symptoms will not be allowed to board. A cabin crew member must inform during the trip the presence of any possible suspicious case to the COVID-19 to the authorities at the airport before arrival. Our health the Ministry of Health in Argentina have developed an app called Cuidar. The Argentine Immigration Office provides that all travelers to Argentina may use the COVID-19 application on their mobile phones and keep it installed for 14 days. At the airport, Argentinian authorities will not require a medical certificate or a PCR test with a negative result for COVID-19. Only another temperature control check will be carried out at the airport, and a formal health declaration must be submitted with the electronic affidavit 48 hours before boarding. But all nationals arriving to Argentina will have to comply with a 14-day quarantine at a hotel or a local home. In Argentina, we are still in lockdown from the 19th of March until 25th of October. There is a mandatory stay-at-home measure that will remain in place in Buenos Aires City and Buenos Aires metropolitan area and the biggest cities in Argentina. And during this period, only essential workers can travel from their home to their workplace. Although special activities have been allowed by the Buenos Aires mayor, there are still many restrictions in place, such as the free movement. If we want to travel within Argentina, we need to apply for a special certificate to circulate. It's an online application form, and it's usually processed within 4 hours. And in addition, if we would like to travel to different provinces, we may have to ask for a special authorization to enter the province and to comply with different requirements. I will now hand over to Margarita from Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Germán. Thank you so much. Regarding health inspections, as of January, Mexican authorities began the implementation of sanitary measures to all individuals entering Mexico, such as random health screenings and a brief questionnaire where it is requested to indicate the presence of any symptoms or recent contact with infected individuals. If any of these questions are replied affirmatively, immigration authority must immediately notify the health authority and lead the person to an isolated area at the airport. Excluding cases of contagion or suspicion of it, there is no obligation to keep mandatory quarantine upon arrival. Also, immigration authorities have issued an official statement by which it is instructed that any person who is knowingly infected with COVID-19, ignoring all health recommendations, and therefore endangering the health of others, may be refused entry or placed at the disposition of the public prosecutor to face criminal charges. As this is a vague and recent provision, and how immigration authorities are planning to implement it and coordinate with the relevant authorities remains to be seen. Regarding residents and visitors, foreign individuals living in Mexico as residents, Immigration Office also established that starting April, all legal terms for expiration dates, extensions, or proceedings for temporary and permanent residents were suspended until further notice. The suspension remains in effect to this date. When the suspension will be lifted, perhaps by the end of the year, but that's set to be determined by immigration authorities in due time. Foreign nationals with a temporary residency whose immigration documents expired while they were abroad are entitled to enter Mexico for the duration of the mentioned suspension. Tourists, business individuals, and visitors stranded in Mexico due to international travel restrictions, also, and in general terms, holders of a multiple immigration form as visitors, also known as FMM in Spanish, are entitled to request for a single occasion the renewal of their immigration forms for additional 180 days, at the end of which they must leave Mexico. Thank you. Now I'll turn it over to Gita.
Okay, so now we want to know, is there an end to all of this? It's impossible to predict, but I'd like everybody to make some comments about what you see on the horizon in your own countries in terms of how your governments are handling anticipate that the restrictions will go. Lauren, will you speak as to the United States? And I would like to remind all the speakers to keep the comments as brief as possible, so we have about 5 minutes or so for questions. Thank you.
In the United States, you all may have heard we have an election coming up on November 3rd. We are going to decide whether to keep Donald Trump another 4 years or get a new president, which would be Joe Biden. That's going to have a major implication for the way the rest of this pandemic and its impact on immigration and mobility unwinds for the United States. This past year, the pandemic has been used as a reason to restrict immigration, not even travel related, but even extension, even things happening within the United States among people who are already here. It's been used as a pretext to block entries because the pandemic has had a really negative impact on employment figures, and that led the presidential proclamation to say, well, if there aren't as many jobs, the jobs that we have should be going to Americans. That's kind of the cycle that we're stuck in right now. It's been a very tough era for legal immigration. And whether that continues in 2021 or not really hinges on how our election goes here in 2 weeks. Thanks.
Katie, do you want to comment on Canada?
Yes, thank you, Gita and Lauren. It's, we have a number of travel restrictions in place. We do expect those to continue. Right now, they come down through what we call orders in council, and these are extended on a monthly basis. They usually by sort of the 20th or 21st or so, I believe it was just extended yesterday actually, we have a new order in council, one for persons coming from the US and one for persons coming from all other countries of the world. I explained earlier that there is that difference on how you can enter. I personally believe those will probably continue at least until next spring. There are, because of the current political climate in the US, we at least, and I'm sure other Canadian immigration firms are finding the same thing, we're receiving many phone calls from companies in the US who either already have a Canadian entity and want to move foreign workers to Canada because they don't want to lose these foreign workers and they're no longer able to extend their current status in the US. Or in some cases, we have heads of companies who are wanting to move their own families to Canada or to even open a new branch that has never been in Canada before of this US company. So we're definitely feeling some outside effects of the current political climate in the USA. For Canadian immigration, Immigration Canada was rather slow to respond to the pandemic. Maybe of a government body in general, and we did have a while for them to come out with new procedures in place. One thing, because we have such a long border in Canada, many people will do what we call is flag polling to change their current status or to change their work permit to work in a new role or with a new employer. And flag polling involves going to the border in person and requesting this change. And of course, going to the border in person is considered non-essential travel. There are ways of changing your work permit online from within Canada, but those changes would take 175 plus days. So the government has now, through the summer, they came out with additional ways for people to make changes to their current working status much more quickly, which would allow them to move into a new role or move to a new employer. And those changes have been very, very positive. It now only takes 4 to 10 business days to make this change, which is really an excellent move forward. And we hope it continues. At this point, though, there are still very, very slow processing times in many countries of the world for people coming from places other than the USA. And one of the major hurdles we face is the biometric requirement, which is photo and fingerprints. And in most of the Central and South American countries right now, the biometric collection locations remain closed and have been closed since March. So even if a person makes a work permit application online, they cannot receive their valid work permit in the end, or even have it approved, because they're not able to provide those biometrics, the photo and fingerprints. So in many cases in countries in South America, many South Asian countries, the application is effectively stalled, and there aren't really very many ways around it at all. I will now go over to Marcela in Chile.
Thank you, Katie. We are not having any precedent, but the government has introduced an immigration bill recently because in the past year, the country has experienced a significant increase in the number of foreigners entering Chile with a tourist visa who ended up remaining in the country illegally. Additionally, the current immigration policy dates back to 1975, so it urgently needs to be updated, redeveloped, and modernized to take account of the country's needs and address the scale of immigration Chile is expecting due to the coronavirus effects. The bill's proposed is not only to update our immigration laws, but also to respond to a potential wave of migration from other Latin American countries following the coronavirus pandemic. The main bill's proposals are to guarantee safe, orderly, and regular immigration in Chile. It especially considers adapting to modern times and the needs of the country, but without losing sight of the rights of and protection for immigrants. Some of the key measures that this bill includes are establish a flexible system of immigration categories, reform the temporary resident visas, and the creation of new categories of visas for people who want to work or study in Chile. So that's mainly what we can see in our horizon here. Isa, do you have any news for Brazil?
Well, I'll stick to the main points since we're running out of time. So we have state of an emergency through December 31st. And through this period, the government is giving financial aid to companies and individuals. Local restrictions vary widely because Brazil is such a big country. The states can impose their own rules, and so can the municipalities. So, it all depends on the state of the stage of the pandemics in each city. Foreign investments, educational issues, due to the pandemics as everywhere else. And we also have major federal police issues concerning appointments for registration of people who have a residency visa for Brazil. I'll pass it on to Diana.
Thank you, Isa. With the lift of the mandatory preventive isolation measures in Colombia, it is evident that the intention at this time is to reactivate economy from local production and from the attraction of foreign investment. As proof of this, the president announced at the end of August the issuance of 4 new decrees framing the commitment of Colombian plan, which seeks to contribute to the economic reactivation and positioning the country as an attractive place for foreign investment. Faced with this last point, the Colombian Investment Summit 2020 has just taken place. It is one of the most important events in terms of attracting foreign investment, and it took place from October 7th to 9th. Investors from Europe, Asia, America participated in this event, and the Colombian government anticipated that there are already $1,300 million promised by foreign companies for operating in the country. In addition, during this event, former US President Bill Clinton highlighted Colombia's potential to attract foreign capital, especially in the areas of renewable energy, forestry, agribusiness, technology, and innovation. This type of initiatives and reactivation will undoubtedly increase the flow of foreigners into the country. It is expected that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the body that issues and approves visas, will act in accordance with the country's economic policies and make immigration processes more flexible. At this time, visa approvals have a lot of delays and a lot of additional requirements that are not mentioned by law. There's a lot of discretionary powers involved. So respecting alignment of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the policies of the government and make processes a little bit more flexible at this stage. So I will pass it over to my colleague Germán from Argentina.
Thank you, Diana. In Argentina, by October 19, our country has become the 5th country in the world to record 1 million confirmed coronavirus cases. It follows the US, India, Brazil, and Russia, all of whom have far bigger populations. There is general consensus that although the early quarantine worked well during the first 90 days to reinforce our health system, avoiding a collapse, it is also true that the extension of a quarantine for 7 months have caused huge economic damage, with thousands of small and medium-sized companies closing down. According to the Argentine National Institute of Statistics, 290,000 formal jobs were lost during the second quarter of this year as a result of the pandemic and the restrictions imposed to contain it. And now, while the new daily infection cases appears to be controlled in the greater Buenos Aires area, the COVID-19 cases have skyrocketed in the interior of the country, especially in the provinces of Santa Fe, Córdoba, Mendoza, and Tucumán. The last presidential decree extending the lockdown until October 25th establishes that the city of Mendoza should return to a compulsory isolation measures, but the governor of Mendoza refused to implement that measure, weakening the position of the national government. Long-term success of any potential lockdown strategy would require a coordination between the national government and the governors. In Argentina, we have 24 provinces, and some of them now are currently imposing internal borders. For example, if I want to travel to Santa Fe, if I don't have a PCR negative COVID-19 test, I will have to comply with a compulsory quarantine for 14 days. And this 14-day quarantine is another, is excessive, and we have to try to find an alternative solutions like the Uruguayan tourist companies are asking to implement, which consists of requesting tourists a negative PCR test with 72 hours of issue, a health insurance, and a reservation in a hotel for 7 nights. After these 7 nights, the hotel will pay for a second PCR test, and if the test is negative, the person will be free to move within the country. This could be a solution to reduce this currently quarantine period of 14 days. In Argentina, we will not have, unfortunately, international flight for tourists, probably until the end of 2020. Immigration office in Buenos Aires, although had reopened, is providing unlimited services with an appointment system that just only for processing temporary and permanent resident applications for Mercosur and extra Mercosur nationals. Some departments are still closed in immigration office, but the new COVID-19 protocol have introduced some order and reduced the waiting time at the immigration office. I will pass now to my colleague from Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in Mexico, Mexican government is aiming to expand and modernize in the next 4 years the infrastructure and equipment for facilitating the entry, stay, and departure of foreign visitors. Nevertheless, regarding the procedures for issuing and processing of visas, no significant changes are foreseen in the near future. On the other hand, regarding the procedures for temporary and permanent residents carried out in the local offices, it is worth mentioning that due to an administrative simplification process that has been hastened by the COVID-19 pandemic, National Immigration Institute is implementing a pilot program by which the majority of the processes shall be requested by means of appointments. Currently, it is merely necessary to submit applications and paperwork during business days. In other words, first come, first serve. However, it is expected that in the forthcoming months, the procedures for residents will be submitted via an electronic appointment calendar, as it is already the case in some Mexican consulates, so that the processing and approvals occurs more efficiently and crowds are avoided. It is estimated that by the end of 2020, every immigration office across the country will have successfully executed the appointment calendar for residents. Also, it is highly recommended to monitor closely further governmental decrees regarding possible amendments or even the lift up of the suspension that I mentioned earlier, in order to avoid expiration dates, penalty fees, and in general inconveniences for the employee and employer. But regarding immigration regulations in Mexico, we don't foresee major changes even with the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much, and I turn it over to Geetha again.
Well, thank you so much to my colleagues for all of those very insightful comments. We are at the 1 hour mark. I will, if your questions haven't been answered, we will answer them offline separately. There was one quick question asking about the availability of a national interest exception for the United States and how to know if an employee qualifies for such an exception. And what I can tell you is we've been very successfully getting national interest exceptions for employees under the economic recovery basis. So essentially, you just need to tie that individual's position with your company and explain that you have U.S. operations in the U.S. and therefore you are contributing to the recovery of the U.S. economy. That's a short answer, but I can answer it more in depth offline. I want to thank all of the participants, all of the attendees for joining us today. I hope you found our comments helpful. And if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us after the program.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you and goodbye.
Yeah, thank you. So unfortunately, like Geetha said, we don't have the time to take all of the questions now, but our presenters can indeed get back to you on those by email. For further information on immigration and global mobility issues, I recommend that you visit our website where you can find updates covering several countries. And for updates on the coronavirus situation, you can visit our coronavirus resource hub, where you can, for example, download our Back to Work guide for international employers. And more on our webinars, you can visit our webinar page, where we keep all the recordings and the slide decks for all past webinars. So finally, me too, I would like to thank everyone for attending, and thanks also to our presenters for their insights. So with that, this webinar will now be ending. Thank you.